Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rick Hasen of UCLA School of Law and the Safeguarding Democracy Project. Welcome to today's webinar on finding common ground in modernizing voter registration. Before we turn to today's event and our excellent panelists, I want to tell you about some upcoming events that we have coming up for the Safeguarding Democracy Project. On March 4th, in person at UCLA and online, we will be holding an event, What Do Documentary Proof of Citizenship Requirements for Voter Registration Accomplish? The panelists there will be Adrian Fontes, who's the Arizona Secretary of State, Walter Olson, who's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and Nina Perales, who is vice president of the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That will be on March 4th at 12:15 Pacific time. The details on how to register for all of these events appears on the Safeguarding Democracy Project website, which is safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. On March 31st, we will have an online webinar entitled Combating False Election Information, Lessons from 2024 and a Look to the Future. The panelists on this one will be Alice Marwick, Director of Research, Data and Society at UNC Chapel Hill, Kate Starbird at the University of Washington, and Joshua Tucker of NYU. And then on April 10th, I said that March 31st event is also at 12:15 Pacific time, March 31st online only. On April 10th, we will have our final webinar of the semester entitled Partisan Primaries, Polarization and the Risks of Extremism. That panel will feature Julia Azari of Marquette University, Ned Foley of Ohio State, Seth Maskett of Denver University, and Rick Pildes of NYU Law School. That one will also be at 12:15 p.m. on April 10th. Again, to register for all of these and to see videos of our past events, go to safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. Today, we are turning to the question of modernizing voter registration, and we have three excellent panelists. Christina Adkins is the Director of Elections for the Texas Secretary of State. In her position with the Texas Secretary of State, Ms. Adkins has served as one of the state's appointed voting system examiners and has worked extensively with election technology issues, including developing standards and training election officials. She's practiced both civil and criminal law and previously worked for the Texas Workforce Commission as an assistant to the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts. She graduated from UT Austin with a degree in English and Mexican American Studies. She received her JD from Southern Methodist University in 2008. Judd Choate is the Colorado Elections Director and Advisory Board Chair and faculty for the Humphrey School of Public Affairs Certificate in Election Administration. Judd was president of the National Association of State Election Directors in 2017 and serves on the executive committee of the Governing Coordinating Council created by the Department of Homeland Security when elections were designated as critical infrastructure. Judd was formerly a professor of political science at the University of Nebraska and author of a book and several peer-reviewed articles on political behavior. And Charles Stewart III is the Keenan Sahin Distinguished Professor of Political Science at MIT, where he has taught since 1985 and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His research and teaching areas include American politics, congressional politics, elections, and American political development. He's been a leader in the field of election science, election systems, election administration, and he served as a member since 2001 of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, a leading research effort that applies scientific analysis to questions of election technology. So welcome to the three of you. Thank you all for joining us today. And I thought I would start by turning to Charles, just to give us a kind of overview for those who are less familiar with the way that the way elections are run in the United States, how the voter registration system works in the United States. Just basically, so we understand how this issue is divided among federal, state, and local rules and administration. Charles.
Great. Thanks, Rick, and thanks for organizing this. Excuse me, and thanks to your staff who are helping to make this happen. So I'm happy to talk very generally about election about voter registration in the United States. And the first thing I will just say as a matter of throat clearing is that, as with everything having to do with describing election administration in the United States, the one thing that we know is there is an exception to everything. So I'll be talking generally about a good deal of this subject, but there are some aspects of voter registration that do apply more or less uniformly nationwide, and I'll try to be clear about that. So obviously, voter registration is the process by which eligible citizens get on the lists of voters. It's mainly justified as a method to ensure that only those who are eligible are able to vote. I think it's fair to say, in addition, that historians of elections will also be quick to point out that the history of voter registration laws, particularly going back in time to the beginning of voter registration, is related to making it harder for the wrong people to vote, even when they were citizens. And that continues to be an issue that arises in voter registration policy. It also helps with the administration of elections. Traditionally, knowing how many people were registered, what precincts they lived in, assisted administrators to know things like how many ballots to print, how to deploy voting machines, and those sorts of things. In states like Colorado, where Judd is from, it also provides the mailing list for vote-by-mail states. So it has a very important administrative function, which is oftentimes lost, I think, in a lot of kind of public discussion about voter registration and the importance of having accurate lists. Now, at a very high level, voter registration works as a state-based system, with some very important exceptions that I'll very quickly get to. States set their own rules, they set their own deadlines, and they set their own methods. Now, there are various methods of registering. In-person registration at departments of motor vehicles, voting offices, et cetera, are kind of the traditional way of registering. Increasingly, there's online registration. There's still some registration by the mails. It's important to note that as of 2022, we don't have the figures from 24 yet, but in 2022, about 3/4 of all new voter registrations nationwide came from either departments of motor vehicles or from online portals. Another thing to be said is now about 23 states have some form of election day registration or same-day registration. There's variation there. And then finally, automatic voter registration that registers people to vote when they touch a state agency, particularly Department of Motor Vehicles. That's about half the states now. Again, there's all sorts of complications there and variation that I won't get into, but that is a very important and increasingly important method and mode of registration. Now, I mentioned that voter registration is fundamentally a state matter, but there's important federal legislation that governs every state. Of course, voting rights and civil rights laws apply to voter registration in the states as it applies to also election administration in general. I'd say there's two major laws that particularly touch on voter registration. The first is the National Voter Registration Act of 1994. Which is probably best known for requiring voter registration opportunities at the departments of motor vehicles, or whatever it's called in your state. For this reason, it's oftentimes referred to colloquially as motor voter. This law requires registration by mail. There's a federal form and there are state forms. Prior to the motor voter NVRA, being able to vote by mail was very rare in the United States. It limits the deadlines for registering to vote in a federal election to 30 days before an election. Before the NVRA, those deadlines varied from a few weeks before an election to many months before an election. So now that's set at 30 days. It mandates and limits simultaneously voter list maintenance, which is sometimes called purging. And I think an important thing to note here is that it prohibits general list maintenance. What we can think about is kind of wholesale cleansing of the rolls within 90 days of election administration. There are provisions in the NVRA that allow to remove people from the rolls if there's specific information about particular individuals. For instance, that someone has died or somebody asked to be removed from the rolls. And then finally, there's the Help America Vote Act, which mandated statewide voter registration databases for all the states. That was 2002. The final thing I'll just say, and then turn it back over to Rick, is that there are that kind of expand out a little bit on the kind of procedures and processes involved in voter list maintenance. It's important to remember that the NVRA requires regular list maintenance to remove people because they've died, they've changed their residence, or disqualification on states that have felon disenfranchisement, which is most states. Another point from the NVRA is that before being removed, voters in general must be notified that they're about to be removed and to remedy that. List maintenance must be uniform and non-discriminatory. And then also states in many cases have additional requirements on top of the NVRA for list maintenance. There are important limitations to the removal from the voter list in the NVRA. People cannot be removed solely for not voting. There is a complicated notice process that I won't get into here, but it's important to note that even when it appears that somebody may have moved because they have not voted, there is still a long period from, or at least a couple of year period from a state noticing that someone has stopped voting, a postcard process and a notice process before removal can occur. And I'll end with this. I think there are a couple of demographic and administrative imperatives in the United States that make list maintenance and voter registration different than probably every other state and every other nation in the world. An important thing I would start with is that we are a highly mobile society. Between presidential elections, almost half of registered voters move. We do not require people when they move to notify officials that they have moved. And that's a big issue. On top of that, about 10% of voters die between presidential elections. And I'll just end with this. When you die, when we all die, we will generate a lot of paperwork. And that gives election officials an opportunity to use official records to remove dead people from the voter rolls. But we do not generate a lot of official paperwork, and oftentimes almost no official paperwork when we move. And that ends up creating a lot of the challenges with list maintenance and many of the controversies with list maintenance. And so I'll stop there. And I know there are many things that we can talk about, but I think that's what I offer is the place for us to get going.
Thanks so much, Charles. I think that if I asked you to describe it in a bit more detail, it would take up the entire hour, given how complex it is and given the interplay between federal and state law. But we're not going to do that. We do want to keep people awake for the entire hour of this webinar. And so I thought I would turn to the two practitioners here, Christina and Judd, and ask the question of, just to start, like, what's working with voter registration, what's not working? What are the biggest obstacles that election administrators and voters face in trying to navigate through this whole system? And let me start with you, Christina, and then I'll come to Judd.
Excellent. Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Charles, for a great description of how this works. And I can tell you, I could listen to you for the whole hour if we needed. I find it very interesting, but that's the nerdy election law side of me. So what's working in voter registration today? I've thought a lot about this question, and it's something that we think a lot about. I think practitioners think about this all the time because we want to replicate what we do well, and we want to improve upon the things that could be done better. And I think when it comes to voter registration, what I kind of settled on as the thing that kind of sums it up for me is the availability of accurate data. I look at the evolution over the last 30 years, looking at NVRA and looking at some of the advances that we've had in technology as far as communicating with other state agencies and being able to get quality and accurate data from other government agencies. And I think that availability of that data, being able to access it, being able to validate that data has made a big difference for us, I think, in the voter registration world, for making sure that we have accurate and up-to-date voter registration lists. As far as things that could be done better, data is only as good as the day it's generated. I think timeliness is really important, that folks have the ability to get data that is timely and that you act on it in a timely fashion. And I know that states have there are a lot of differences from state to state and kind of what their state parameters are in that area. And I think sometimes those differences, create confusion within the community about what can and can't be done in those timeframes. And I think, when you have interested enthusiasts out there and they're learning about things in one state and trying to apply it to another, I think that's where we, oftentimes have some concerns and questions about voter registration accuracy. And so I think sometimes just navigating the fact that we do have differences between our states, I think that is a challenge as far as from what I see, and making sure that people understand the story of how voter registration works.
Before I turn to Judd, let me just follow up, Christina, and ask you, I think Texas is probably the largest state that does not have online voter registration. I think
That's
that's right.
correct. That's correct.
So does that inhibit your ability to get, I mean, I always feel like I can do a better job spelling my last name than somebody can doing data entry at being paid minimum wage. Does that create a special impediment for you in Texas?
That's a great question. I think those are decisions, that our office doesn't really have a lot to do with. Those are decisions of our lawmakers, and we have to trust that our state legislatures are making the decision as to what they think is best for this community and best for our state. I think what I would say there is about 85% of my registrations come from our state DMV. And so we already get a really, really high percentage of registrations that are sent to us, that are transmitted to us safely and securely within our system. And I have a high degree of confidence in that data that I'm getting from my state DMV. I have a high degree of confidence in just their overall data quality, because I've worked with them quite a bit over the last 5 years to make sure that we're both understanding of kind of what our needs and requirements are. And so, because we already get so many registrations through that process, the other thing I guess I've looked at how voter registration or online voter registration has been done in other jurisdictions, and there are, varieties of how to do this, what information is necessary to authenticate a voter and whatnot. And I don't know that, looking at the number of applications I get where people just provide a social security number, which is about 5% of my applications. Even my paper applications, I get about 10% that have a driver's license and about 5% that have a social security number. I don't know that a lot of that would change. So even in the absence of online voter registration, we have folks that do a lot of work with voter registration drives. Those paper applications, I just don't think are ever going away. I think some folks just like to register that way and prefer the process of filling out something by hand. So I don't know how that would change our landscape in Texas, because we already get so many through our DMV that I don't know that it would add a lot. But if the legislature chooses to go that route, I'd be interested to see how that would happen.
Thank you for that. Judd, you're in a state that is very different in terms of much heavier emphasis than Texas on vote by mail. I don't know if that affects how you think about voter registration, but what's working, what's not? What do you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Rick. And I agree, Charles did a great primer on the state of voter registration. I'll note that Christina and I, that would have been essentially what I would have said, that the evolution of data is really the great thing that's happened over the last 20 years. I've been working in this business for almost 20 years now, and we just didn't have very good data 20 years ago. And we have much better data now. It's transferred to us much faster in secure ways. We can feel more confident about that data. We have ways to check it. So those are certainly the advancements that I see. And then specifically, as it relates to automatic voter registration, Colorado has really sort of dived deep into the pool on AVR. We are very aggressive on AVR.
Explain what AVR is for those who
Yeah,
are...
AVR is automatic voter registration. That's Section 5 MVRA compliance. I think, as Charles mentioned, the National Voter Registration Act was passed in 1993 and became law in 1994. And it requires that states, at least 44 states, not the 6 others, but 44 states, where the DMV must work with the elections officials to provide an opportunity for people who get a driver's license or a state ID to register to vote. And what we've done and what many states have done is taken that process and made it automatic, so that every transaction, we are automatically notified about that transaction the next morning at 4 o'clock in the morning. We queue those up for our counties. And so when Charles in our state changes his address from 101 Main Street in Denver to 202 Main Street in Jefferson, we know about that change, and that change is automatically processed by the counties within 24 to 48 hours. So that's one of the sort of exchanges of data which has really made our job much more effective. One other thing I would say along those lines is that because there are so many more ways to register and so many ease of voter methods to do that work, like AVR, but also online voter registration and others. One of the challenges that we have now, and I can speak for Colorado, but I suspect a lot of states feel this way. We are to the point where we've gotten all the low-hanging fruit on the tree. Most of the easy registrations are already registered. Most of those voters are already captured in our database. It's harder to get the folks that are somewhat off the grid, perhaps not fully employed, perhaps don't have secure housing. Those are more difficult. Younger voters, those are the more difficult groups of people to get into our database. And there is just a certain pocket of people that fall into that group. And for us, it's around like 7% of the population. We've gotten to about 93% registered of eligible. And I'm not sure that we can really get beyond that, because that group is a really tough group to tap into. The interesting thing is that Canada, if you ask Canadian officials, I've been fortunate to develop some great relationships with some Canadian officials. They're registered at 93, 94, 95%, and they struggle with that last group. And it's a law. When you move from one jurisdiction to another in Canada, you're required to tell the elections administrator so that they can move you. And they have all these automatic processes. So we're sort of to the point where we're trying to tap into a really difficult group. But the things that we really have that are working are exchange of data.
So before I turn to Charles, let me just ask, is most of the improvement, you were comparing the situation today to 20 years ago, is most of the improvement because of improved technology, the way computers talk to each other, or is it partly driven by law? Like, is it HAVA? Like, what makes it better?
I think you left out the most important one, Rick, which is attitudes. When I started as an elections administrator, the elections administrators, certainly at the state level, and I don't want to speak for counties and locals, but at the state level, the attitude of elections administrators was that they were generally a filing office where stuff came in and they made the appropriate designation, put it in the database, added it to the poll book. But over the last 20 years, the role of an elections administrator has really expanded to be more proactive. And so when you're proactive, you then go and look for those technologies, you look for the relationships, you start comparing databases, you start trying to reach for data that maybe you didn't have and don't have a way to get. So I think it's attitudinally changed a lot.
And that's maybe tied into more professionalization of election administration.
I think you're exactly right. Professionalization and frankly, bringing in people that have some advanced education, people that have analytical skills. Christina obviously is a very accomplished lawyer. This is the way that the field has sort of evolved over the last 2 decades.
If you're watching this live on Zoom and you have questions, you can use the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen, and I'll try and get to some of your questions near the end. Charles, we've been listening to a couple of election administrators, and they're generating more light than heat, which is not what's normally happens these days when we hear about elections. And so, I'm wondering about the potential for finding common ground and trying to modernize things further. So, as an outside observer, can you kind of talk about what you see as you look across states, as you look across all of the political fighting that's going on about how elections are run? That's like one conversation, and then as the election administrators are actually doing the job, they seem to be having a totally different conversation. And so what's your observation about how that plays out, particularly in terms of the question of voter registration?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'll start the answer by basically repeating the premise of the question, which is that right now, I mean, my observation. So, I mean, I am an academic, as you note. In fact, I tell people my favorite thing about studying election administration is hanging out with election officials and just sitting in the back of the room and listening to them talk. And when you listen to election officials talk at the state level, at the local level, and actually, I have to say, when you get even state legislators in a room on a non-attribution basis, you get a different sense of a conversation than you do publicly. And in fact, if you would pose to me what's not working, and I'll answer your question, but for the prior question, one of the things that's not working right now is that there really is kind of a disjuncture in the public in talking about issues of election administration. In some ways, we're stuck back in the 1980s and 1990s in terms of technology, also in thinking in terms of access to election registration and those sorts of things. And what's happening talking in the public versus what officials and legislators talk about in private is also different. So what am I hearing? Well, some general things and then some very specific things. One general thing is, I think there is a general sense that there are elements of the NVRA that are just really antiquated. And I'm not saying that everyone would agree to just modernize it, but it does seem to me that there are elements within it such that you could maybe satisfy the moderate left and the moderate right to do some modernization. And I'd be curious also to see what Judd and Christina have to say. But things, for instance, many states are getting many more people onto the rolls, and the fail-safes are much greater than they used to be. AVR in many states functions basically as election day registration. Many states now have election day registration. So to think about this kind of notice system that relies on people reading a postcard, which no one reads anymore, even if it shows up on their door. There's that whole notice process that is just really antiquated, and there may be some opening there. So there's that general sense that just it's a law based on paper, and we live in a world based on computers. So that's kind of general thoughts. Specific thought has to do with the current hot topic in election administration, which is making sure that non-citizens are not on the voter rolls. And this is clearly a hot topic, and I would say it's something that would need to be dealt with very gingerly, But my observation is, again, the left and the right, thoughtful people on the left and the right have an equal interest in minimizing non-citizens on the rolls, and also recognize that all the evidence is that the number of non-citizens on the rolls is vanishingly small. But nonetheless, it's become an issue. And on the right, I think it's kind of understood, well, the right is concerned about non-citizens voting. The left is aware, especially if you are a non-citizen on the voting rolls, even inadvertently, you will not become a citizen. You will just not become a citizen. And so making sure that we figure out a way of just ensuring that non-citizens are not on the rolls is an administrative thing that I think could be worked out in a quasi nonpartisan way. Again, it won't happen fluidly, but I could imagine a way in which it could be accomplished that would do minimum harm and would benefit benefit election officials, and again, the non-citizens who are on inadvertently, which is by far the the major reason why non-citizens end up being on the rolls.
We're going to actually have an event on March 4th talking about the SAVE Act and documentary proof of citizenship. So we'll say a little bit about that. I see that in Judd's shot, I see one of his constituents has come into the shot over there. Very cute little puppy there. Judd, let me come to you and ask you, because the whole impetus of this panel was you and I were having a discussion about the NVRA being somewhat outdated and there being room for modernization. Now, 1993 is not that old as federal statutes go. I mean, the Voting Rights Act is 1965, the Federal Election Campaign Act is 1976, but with so many changes in technology and with how people move and how they relate to paper, as Charles said, my kids don't have stamps. They have to come to my house if they need to mail a letter. They're not checking their mailbox every day. It's a different world. Where do you see room in the NVRA for some kind of common ground on modernization?
Yeah, so great question, and that is the issue of the NVRA that's really stifling innovation across a lot of states when it comes to list maintenance. So I'll give you an example. Colorado has around 350,000 inactive voters right now. An inactive voter is a voter who we mailed something to, in Colorado's case, probably a ballot. And that ballot came back to us as undeliverable. We made that person's active record into an inactive record. We then sent them a confirmation card to confirm that that address is no longer good for that voter. That card came back to us. Now we have an undeliverable confirmation card. We can start the NVRA clock, which means you have to hold that person for 2 federal election cycles before you can cancel them from your rolls. So 350,000 of those folks are in that status in Colorado. I would note that we actually have like 325,000 of them or so are in the last couple of elections, but we have these holdovers from previous elections and all the way back into the 1990s because a county failed to do the mailing that came after the inactivity, or they did the mailing after the inactivity, but they didn't tell the voter registration database that. So the database goes to pull the record to know who to cancel, and they don't know that that person is cancelable. What do you do with those old records when some of those addresses don't even exist anymore? So we can't even mail to those addresses. Many of those people have been dead or moved to other states long, long ago. And there's really nothing we can do about that except for restart the clock, send them a new mailing, and wait 4 years. So it's the NVRA is painful. And you mentioned when it was passed. Well, it became law on August 1st, 1994. The exact moment in which the world was moving to electronic, and it creates this mandatory paper regime, and these series of dates and record keeping that just doesn't match where we are as a society and where we've come as a society. So I have a whole bunch of people on in my inactive database that I should be able to cancel. I know they don't live here. I can tell that they live in Washington State or Texas or Tennessee. I can see that they live there because maybe they're in Eric State, or maybe I get an NCOA notification that's a national change of address from the United States Postal Service that tells me they live in Illinois now. Well, I should be able to cancel that person, but I can't because I have this, frankly, very antiquated federal law. Now, there are parts of the MVRA that are working great, and I wouldn't suggest you change those. But Section 8 has a whole bunch of ways in which we could change it and make a serious improvement.
Before I turn to Christina, maybe Judd, you could kind of sketch out what that might look like a little bit, and
Yeah.
how, for people who worry, and it's already, I see questions in the Q&A box about fear of politically motivated voter purges to remove eligible voters. Like, what's the safeguard going to be if you're going to not give this longer period for people who just for one reason or other decided not to vote in a few elections?
Well, I know that not everybody would agree with this, but the obvious solution is to say, I can cancel any person that I have a reasonable belief no longer lives in my jurisdiction, pretty much at my will, as long as I have same-day registration. If I have same-day registration, then I have the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card, because if they show up at my polling place on election day or one of the days prior to election day, they can re-register, or they can update their registration. They can say, no, I was here. I don't know why I sent my mail back, but let me get my registration cleaned up. And that person can get back on the rolls and they can get a ballot. So that's the marriage. The marriage is, let's cancel, people that are easily cancelable. Just give people a chance and an opportunity to get back on. I know that not everybody's going to agree with that, and frankly, that would be a lift for many states to get that through as a policy. But that's the obvious marriage. The other thing is, don't make me hold people for 4 years. Let me cancel after 1. Let me cancel after 6 months. Let me cancel after 1 year, a year and a half. But don't make me carry 10% of my electorate on this inactive list for basically, what amounts to 4 years plus.
Yeah, I mean, I was just surprised, even though I don't follow this as closely as any of you, but when Charles gave the statistics of how many people are moving each year, it just becomes an incredibly moving target to have to deal with. Christina, how do these NVRA requirements look to you where you are, and do you see this same kind of room that Judd does for potential modernization?
Absolutely. And I think one thing that Judd didn't mention, but when you have the inability to cancel voters that are not or are likely not residents or not eligible, or for whatever the reason is that triggered them in being in that category, it's the optics of it too. I think that we have folks that are looking at our voter registration rolls very closely, probably more so now than they have been in the past. And some of them are doing some really great work in finding anomalies within the rolls, or finding issues, or finding duplicate voters that are registered in multiple states. And I think when I've seen a lot of that data, it's usually old registrations. I'm seeing a lot of older registrations that I can't do anything about. So I know that this is an issue, but I don't necessarily have the immediate fix to address that issue. And again, it's just the perception and the concern that it causes. I would also say, I do echo what Judd said about notification requirements just in general. I think we need to think about other ways of communicating with folks besides just the US mail. Because we do have a mobile society, and because people rely on technology so much, I think we need to be open to other mechanisms to communicate concerns or problems with somebody's voter registration. And I think that'll be a much more effective tool in getting a response from voters if they can get that notification in multiple different formats. And then I think one other thing that I think Charles touched on a little bit is, because of the availability of data right now, because we do have the ability, excuse me, to get strong and accurate data from so many different government sources at this moment, I'm wondering if we need to think about more front-end eligibility verifications. And that's something I think what Charles alluded to with the citizenship issues and the citizenship questions. You know, if I have ways of validating, you know, eligibility issues or validating residency issues using available data from government agencies where a voter has provided, you know, accurate information about themselves, I think that can help provide more confidence in the voter rolls as well. You know, right now, a lot of that is left to the back end process, the list maintenance process. But that made sense, you know, when we didn't have that kind of data access. And so it may be worth thinking about now that we look at adding some requirements or adding some options on the front end to make sure that we are ensuring eligibility and residency when at the time of registration.
Thank you for that. So Charles, what I think is implicit in what both Judd and Christina were saying is both that they want to have accurate lists because they want to run an efficient ship that's where the records are accurately reflecting what's going on, but also that bloated rolls fuel conspiracy theories about dead voters voting and all kinds of ineligible people voting. One way of trying to deal with these problems in a decentralized system is states to cooperate with each other and share information. And the way that happened was through ERIC, and that kind of broke down this year. I'm wondering if you could kind of tell the story of what happened with ERIC and briefly, and what can we do about that in this current environment?
The first thing I'll say is my friends who are on this call, in different ways, were in the middle of this, and so I'm sure they will correct me where I get it wrong. So let me just do things at a very high level, and they can fill in the details. First of all, the Electronic Registration Information Center, ERIC, was created about a decade ago. Over a decade ago, as a state-owned, state-governed, compact, if you will, small
States-owned, right? Multiple states. Yes.
Multiple states. And it had grown to encompass most states. And it was originally created by a group of red and blue and purple states. And like I said, it had grown over time. And I think it's fair to say has been considered, and I continue to consider it the gold standard in doing interstate matching. And I'll say a couple of reasons. I can say a couple of reasons for that. But there were a couple of issues, and I'll just stay at a high level. It seems to me one was, there's no other way than saying it, ERIC getting pulled into the misinformation maw that happened to a lot of election-related things around the 2020 election, and just false things being said about the governance structure of ERIC, the structure of ERIC, the funding for ERIC, and those sorts of things, to the point which led to a number of states pulling out just because of that controversy. And I have talked to some folks who are kind of far on the right-hand side of the political spectrum who have been ERIC skeptics for many years, who have stated to me that they may have kind of overshot this. There were issues with ERIC, but what happened to ERIC as a consequence of that controversy was overshooting the mark. Nonetheless, there was just that. There were some substantive issues that I know that Judd, who's been involved with ERIC since the beginning, I believe, had to do with some issues about, there's two parts to ERIC. There's the list matching, and then there's also the mailing to eligible but unregistered voters that you discover when you do the matching. Basically, people on the driver's license list who are not registered, there must be a mailing to them, and that's an expensive mailing. And so I think, just to give a little gloss on it, it's reasonable to ask whether that's worth that mailing is worth its while, given other ways of reaching EBUs. But in this kind of political world we live in, the fact that the unregistered were associated with being low income and Democratic voters, Eric got kind of painted as being a left-wing mobilization organization. And so that's kind of my take on it. Again, my colleagues will have, more details and other thoughts about it. But it has left a number of states pulling out, and then having to find ways to engage in interstate matching that are as effective and accurate, but also as cheap on a per unit basis, and also respective of security and accuracy as well.
Christina, what's your take on this whole question about, and not just about Eric, but about state cooperation as a way, since you mentioned potentially getting data from the federal government, but obviously states can be sharing information with each other.
Absolutely. And I think many states continue to do that, and even did it, predating Eric. We've always been receiving information from other states about registrations that occur in their state where somebody was previously registered in Texas. So I just think it's important to note that a lot of that state-to-state sharing has been in place for years, because this community recognizes the importance of making sure that we prioritize that kind of information sharing. I think what I would add to that is that, for us in Texas, and I think this is true for most states out there, Eric was not our exclusive source of list maintenance data. We had a pretty robust list maintenance program in Texas before we joined Eric. And Eric did provide some supplemental data sources that were helpful and useful. And I think for me, the takeaway and the lesson there, our legislature, passed a law that made it very clear, what participation we can do with cross-state programs or entities or jurisdictions. And the way the law was written, it excluded our participation from programs like Eric. And I'll say the takeaway for me there is that, I want to be very careful about relying on any kind of third-party organization to provide data to me when I can get that data directly from other sources, or directly from the original source. And so what I've looked at here in Texas is, what was the data that I received from Eric, and are there sources within my state, within other government agencies within my state, that I can get that data and I can get it in a way that's, in some cases, more secure because of existing relationships that we have, and because of the connections we have being state agencies. Can I get that data from them, and can I utilize it in a way that accomplishes those same goals? And so far, we've been pretty successful in Texas in being able to replicate the data sources that we receive from Eric. We are actually talking to a lot of states right now. I've got a pretty big number of states in which we're discussing MOUs. We're on the verge of signing some MOUs with some states to share voter participation data. That is the one little piece that I haven't been able to replicate through any other centralized source. And that makes sense, because that information is maintained within each state. But the fact that I can identify which states are likely to have potential Texas voters, or where there's a strong pipeline, Colorado to Texas has a pretty strong pipeline of voters that move between our states. I can target those states and work with them directly to get that information, and we can make sure that we're doing it in a secure way. And again, because I'm going directly to that source, I think it gives me a little bit more insulation and protection, and I feel a lot of confidence, because I know that when I'm reaching out to a state for their data, they understand and they value the confidentiality of that data, the protection of that data. And I think we work closely to make sure that we are protecting our voters both in their state and in Texas. And so so far, we've had a pretty good experience in being able to replicate those sources, and in being able to continue a lot of those relationships that we have for data sharing with other states.
I'll have to let the MIT person do the math and tell me how many compacts there'd have to be if each state is making separate MOUs with each other state. That would be a lot. But before I come back to Charles, I'm going to come back to you, Charles, and ask you about the political reality of something actually happening in the next 4 years. I want to come to you, Judd, since you were so intimately involved with all of the stuff related to Eric, for your perspective on where things were and where things are on this question.
Yeah, well, I think Christina's kind of laid out the the sort of the alternative perspective for the states that left Eric, or the states that never joined and you never got the benefits of it. If you step back from Eric, just think of it as it was a way to collect data and then curate that data and send it on to the states. So it collected USPS, National Change of Address, and it said, here are the ones that relate to your state, relate to your voters. Here's that data, do with it as you will. And it sends it to the state. And it collected SSDI, so the Social Security Death Index. And it collects that data, matches it up to the list provided by the state, and that tells you who was on the national death list. And you can take that data and do with it what you will. So that's the way Eric worked. Was it took this data and that data and compared it to the state list and gave you the information that you could use to do whatever you wanted to do with that data. Colorado's been pretty aggressive on some of that, but frankly, on some of the other ones, we haven't been as aggressive. We've picked and choose. It's sort of a smorgasbord. There's some things we really like and we really pursue. There are some other areas where we just don't feel like that's as useful to us, or maybe we don't have the mechanism or technology to be able to make it useful. So that's the great thing about it, is you can really use that data like you want to. The kinds of things that a state leaving is missing or losing is that overall move data. So the data that tells me, oh, one of my voters moved from Colorado to Utah. That's an interesting piece of information for me. So now I can reach out to that voter and I can tell them, hey, it looks like you've moved. We don't want you on our database. If you've moved, please come back to our website and cancel your voter registration. So we could do that, and we can exchange mail and start the MVRA clock quicker. So that's a good thing. And then the note that Christina said at the end there, which is the double voter list, what we call the voter participation list, which is people have multiple addresses. They're often relatively wealthy. They have an address in both Texas and Colorado. And by the way, Christina's totally right. We have a pipeline to Texas. Texas has a pipeline to Colorado. And we got a lot of people that live in both states in various parts of the year. Well, they could easily register themselves and have a good faith basis to register themselves in both of those addresses, and then get ballots at both of those addresses and vote both of those ballots. Well, there's a number of features in what I just said that are not legal, but you can do it because of the way that our processes work, and the fact that Texas's data is migrated into Texas box and Colorado's data is in the Colorado box. And the voter participation work that Eric was doing and still does for the remaining states is really effective, because what it does is it allows me to know, hey, I've got 20 people that are Colorado residents that are in these other states that attempted to vote or did vote in the 2024 election. I need to do something about that. I need to take those to my AG, make sure they get prosecuted. I need the other state or other states to do something with the cases that they have that are more appropriate for them to prosecute. So that's like this really fundamental part of Eric that I get a lot of benefit out of. And I just would point out the irony that the states that have left Eric would be the states most likely to find that data especially useful. So I just point that out, that that some of the states that we've lost are the states that probably could have benefited the most from that.
We've only got about 5 minutes left. There's 10 questions in the Q&A. I'm not going to get to all of them, but I'll try and weave some of them into my final question to Charles, which is about the political reality at this moment of trying to do things. I mean, some of these questions I see are worried about Republicans using National Voter Registration Act reform as a means of just getting rid of the NVRA requirements related to facilitating voter registration at places like DMVs and other facilities, and some are worried that the costs of this to voters are not being taken into account, and others are distrustful of the federal government having more of a say in how elections are run. Like in this environment, with Republicans poised to try to pass this, the SAVE Act, which deals with documentary proof of citizenship, and Democrats all opposed to it, can anything happen in the short term?
Right. No. So next
All
question.
right, see you all. Bye bye.
Well, earlier that articulate. First of all, as I think mentioned in an answer to a previous question, I think there's probably more opportunities for administrative movement on some of these issues than legislative movement, and I say that in part because in addition to studying election administration and the other 80% of my life, I study congressional legislative politics, in addition to the 80% of my life in which I study election administration. There, I mean, there's just basically both Democrats and Republicans in my view at the national level have in recent years being basically overreaching with respect to these comprehensive election administration bills, the SAVE Act for the Republicans, HR 1 with the Democrats. And my sense is that the SAVE Act is overreach and is going to be a victim of a filibuster and things like that. So I don't see things happening at the national level so much right now, especially in areas that people are kind of worried about. That's why, pay attention to what's happening in the states. And there's a lot of interest right now with, for instance, proof of citizenship in order to register at the state level. I'm really looking forward to help you show for the next event. I'm really looking forward to that because my sense is that when I talk to the public, I talk about something I'll call how hard can it be-ism that infects election administration reforms. And once, in my mind, once you really think through proof of citizenship, then especially if you lay that over on possibilities of ending a birthright citizenship, which is probably, we can bet on that one. There's all sorts of second and third order effects that have not been thought through that I don't think anybody would be really happy with. So, but anyway, state level, certainly areas for legislation, and certainly it looks like there's right now a lot of citizenship bills either passing state legislatures or going to go to will go to the public in terms of referenda or initiatives.
Well, I think about 11 years ago, I was on a lobbying reform commission from the ABA, and I remember Trevor Potter, who was running it. I said, why are we doing this? It's not going to happen now. He said, well, it's on the shelf for when the time is ready. So when the time does come for a national conversation about voter registration modernization, I hope that lawmakers will be looking at this recording and seeing that there is, in fact, a place where we can make things better for everyone. And hopefully we can move forward. Thank you all, Christina Adkins, Judd Choate, Charles Stewart. I'm Rick Hasen. Join us again on March 4th when we dive into the documentary proof of citizenship question, both in person and online. safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all. Bye-bye.